Welcome to Safer Skies. I'm Robert Sumwalt, host of the Safer Skies video podcast, a production of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University's Boeing Center for Aviation and Aerospace Safety. On Safer Skies, we tell the stories behind rigorous innovations that shape aviation and aerospace's highest safety standards. Today we'll meet a NASA Space Shuttle astronaut and discuss her journey into space. But first, let's talk about the shuttle itself. The Space Shuttle is one of the most complex machines ever devised. With 2.5 million parts, 230 miles of wire, and over 1,000 valves, in just over 8 minutes, the Space Shuttle accelerates to an orbital velocity of 17,500 miles per hour. That's 25 times faster than the speed of sound. For our very first video podcast, today we welcome Dr. Janet Kavandi, a veteran of 3 NASA Space Shuttle missions, where she logged more than 33 days in space and circled the globe 535 times. She later served as Deputy Chief of the NASA Astronaut Office, followed by tenure as Director of Flight Crew Operations at NASA's Johnson Space Center. And then she moved to lead the NASA Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio. And after retiring from NASA in 2019, Dr. Kavandi went on to become President of Sierra Space, where she served for 5 years. And among other accomplishments, Janet is an inductee into the U.S. Astronaut Hall of Fame, and she serves on the Board of Trustees for Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Janet, welcome, and thank you for joining us on Safer Skies.
Oh, Robert, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, thank you. Delighted to have you. I know from being around you that you have a true passion for the things that you have done and continue to do. Tell us what ignited that passion.
Oh gosh, I know a lot of people ask me about that because they are interested in knowing sometimes how to get their kids passionate about a subject, or just themselves are interested in a passion for any kind of interest that they have. But I think I can trace mine back to my childhood. My father and I were very close, and we used to spend a lot of time together on the back porch looking at the night sky. And so I think, sitting out there, looking up at the stars, thinking about what it might be, like to go up there and look back at the Earth. That's when Americans were first starting to fly in space, and he would ask questions like, what do you think it would look like to look at the Earth from up there? What, do you think you could see our farm or, us on a porch? And for a 5 or 6-year-old, that was a big question. So, I think all those thoughts and memories kind of, came with me my whole life and kind of guided me in this direction.
That's absolutely incredible, and it just shows that our formative years can certainly lead to our later years in life. I do know that you say that you're not a risk taker in the traditional sense, that you're not a bungee jumper. I don't think you've jumped out of airplanes. Maybe you have. You don't climb mountains, but you have flown into space. And so what is driving this desire of yours to be a space explorer?
Well, it's not for the purpose of taking risk, although I do take calculated risk, which I think most people do every day as we drive and fly and do things like that. But it is, I think we should all take risks with calculating, is it worth, is the reward worth the risk? And in my case, in this particular passion, all the things that I think that NASA and the United States has achieved by going into space produces results that make it worth that risk. And all the people that I know that I flew with all accepted that risk, knowing that the results and the science that we brought back would be good for humanity. And those are the reasons they chose to still fly despite the accidents that the space program has had. And I shared that, so I think that's why I pursued those objectives.
Fantastic. Early in your career, you ended up at Boeing. You worked there for 11 years. What did you do at Boeing?
At Boeing, I was working on power systems. So I have a degree in chemistry, and batteries are electrochemical, and fuel cells are electrochemical processes. So I worked on power systems for primarily defense, but also space applications. It was the very beginning of what we were working on, an eventual space station. And so I was working on payloads, or we called them payloads at NASA, but they're experiments that go on the International Space Station or on the space shuttle. How are those powered? And so I was working on that. It's not what I wanted to do forever, but it was a good job, and I really enjoyed it.
And while you were in the Seattle area working for Boeing, you pursued your PhD. What is your PhD on?
My PhD is in analytical chemistry, and I did it in an applied sense, in that I used it to make a pressure-sensitive paint that could be applied to aerodynamic surfaces that, when placed in a wind tunnel, would give a continuous pressure map of the surface. And that was to replace all the pressure taps that had been currently used at that time for measuring pressure maps of aerodynamic surfaces. This was more accurate and more real time. And so it gave the designers better information to create wings that helped, that were safer, and fuselages, and the whole aerodynamic design that would make aircraft more fuel efficient and safer overall.
Interesting. Thank you. Let's back up just for a minute. Tell us a little bit about your family.
My family, yeah, we can't leave that out. I personally feel that it's not just my journey and my spouse's journey and our careers, but we also had 2 children, or have 2 children, and those 2 individuals had needs, and trying to balance family and work. My husband's an airline pilot, just recently retired, and so we had an astronaut and a pilot with 2 little kids, and managing all of that as we were each pursuing our dreams to fly in 2 different locations, but definitely our dreams were being fulfilled. We also had to care for those kids. They survived all that, and they are in their early 30s now, and I have a scientist and an engineer as a result. So I'm very proud of them and of my husband, and that we were able to make it all work. And
I don't know how you did. I don't know how you did it, but you've done it, and I know they're proud of you. But I know that you're proud of them as well.
very much.
And I know your husband, and I know that he is extremely proud of you.
Oh, thank you.
What attracted you to follow your dream and become a NASA astronaut?
Oh, well, as a kid, if you said you wanted to be an astronaut, first of all, there were no female astronauts when I was growing up, so it was kind of just a joke, and everyone laughed whenever I would say that. So I learned not to talk about it, and I never actually talked about it to anybody other than my husband. If I told my advisor about it or anybody else, it was just laughed off. But eventually, near the end of my high school years, NASA was selecting the first shuttle astronauts, which did happen to have females for the first time and non-military pilots. And so I thought, wow, maybe this is possible now, that I could maybe someday have a chance. So I knew that I would have to be very good. I would have to, be at the top of the class. I would have to have good grades. And so I just pursued those studies. I looked at the biographies of those who had been selected, and tried to make myself as much like them as possible.
Wow. How many people were in the pool of candidates, and how many were eventually selected?
In my
Yes.
class?
Yes.
I think there were close to 3,000 who had applied, and 19 Americans were selected, and then we had some internationals as well.
Wow. Those are some strong odds, but you made it.
I don't know how. After you interview and you meet all those crazy, impressive people, and they pick you, you're just floored. It's amazing.
Well, I know Jim Weatherby, who was an astronaut, and Jim was on your selection board, I think, and he speaks very highly of you.
Oh, that's nice.
So you were selected in December of '94, I believe, and then started training in the spring of 1995. So describe that training process. That must have been very lengthy and very rigorous.
It was about an 18-month program, almost 2 years, I would say, and it was rigorous. So I had soloed in a Cessna, but that was about as far as I got with my aviation career with having kids and going for my PhD. So they put us into T-38 aircraft, which are, supersonic jets that the Air Force used in the past to help train their military pilots. So that was a big jump for me. We did water survival training and land survival training. We did all the coursework where we had to learn all the systems for the space shuttle. And but most of the time it was the bonding with our new class. That was the best. That was the funnest part of everything, was getting to know your new classmates. And there was competition, but not really like you would have expected. Everyone was there to help each other to do very well.
Your first mission was in June of 1998. It was on Discovery,
Correct.
and I think you docked with the Mir space station.
We did.
Describe that first flight into space.
That is a fun thing to describe, because all your life you've been waiting for this chance, right, to experience what space flight is like. And so you're waiting there on the pad. Of course, you're not in this horizontal position, you're vertical. And so you're lying on your back and you can hear all of the chatter and mission control. And the crew members are chatting with each other. And then the countdown begins. And then the heart rate goes up. and you just can't believe that you're about to achieve this dream that you've only thought about your entire life. And so having that, feeling the motion of the vehicle as they call it the twang, as the bolts are released, the main engines ignite. Well, actually, the other way around. The main engines ignite, and then the bolts are released, um, and then you are thrust off the pad, and you are pushed back in your seat, and you just accelerate off that pad like crazy. And so the tears are running down my face because you're like this, so they're going right into my ears, which I think is hilarious. But it's not for fear. It's just that your dreams are happening, and it's sometimes you just can't believe those things are really happening to you. A kid from Missouri, how did I get here? And it's just, unbelief.
Did you ever get that out there, get strapped in, and then the mission was scrubbed?
I have done that on my second flight. We did scrub, and it was not a surprise because it was pouring down rain, thunderstorms going on, and so we were just joking out there because we knew we weren't going anywhere.
So I think you told me once that during liftoff, you were actually dying laughing.
I was laughing, yeah. So on my second and third flights, I had the great fortune of being the flight engineer, which is the center seat in between the pilot and commander. Just for you who may not know, the commander is on the left, the pilot is on the right, because no one wants to be a co-pilot on the space shuttle. So, and the flight engineer sits in the middle. And I could not help but laugh every time we lifted off. It's like being the front seat of a roller coaster, right? When you go over the top and you have that feeling inside your stomach that kind of lifts up and it tickles. And to me, it was that same kind of exhilaration that I felt when I lifted off the pad. And so it was an involuntary laugh as we took off every time.
That's amazing. Didn't the commander later say something to you?
I think a couple of them did. Like, I cannot believe you are laughing at such a harrowing moment in our lives, and you are laughing. But it was, I couldn't help it.
Wow. Was looking back on it, has there been some profound revelation while you're up in space, looking out, looking at Earth? I've heard that many astronauts say that they, quote unquote, they see the world differently. Has your perspective changed of just how minuscule we are in the bigger scheme of things? Or talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think, well, for one, that's true. I didn't get that far away from the Earth like the people who've been to the moon did. But you do see things for yourself that you have heard about, but never had the fortune of seeing. So, for instance, going around the Earth and seeing places on the planet where there is strife below, and looking from above, it's you can't see that, and you're wondering up there, like, I wonder why for so many centuries, perhaps even, people have been fighting over that spot on the grounds. But people, culturally, religiously, we as humans, we tend to cling onto things and are willing to go to the death for things that from up there, you wonder why it's that important. You are on this ball, there's nowhere else to go, and it's more apparent that we should be trying to get along on this planet rather than not. The other thing that I think I saw that was kind of sobering is you can see the changes that humans affect on the planet. So flying over the Amazon River, for instance, you'll see the Amazon going across, and then you'll see the clear cutting areas, and you can see the forested areas that haven't been touched, and then the parts that have been, and then all the topsoil that's running into the Amazon, and then you can see it pouring off into the Atlantic Ocean, and you're like, wow, that's a lot of dirt that we cannot recover. And so things like that are made very obvious, and you can see why people are concerned about the effects that we're having on the planet.
Interesting. So let me ask a very basic question, sort of a dumb question, but what do you do when you're in space?
Oh gosh, there's a lot to be done. There are experiments that you're doing all the time. You're always taking data, depending on the purpose of the flight. For instance, on my second mission, we were mapping the Earth in very high definition. And we were taking videotape, terabytes of data, 24/7. So we always had crews up and working all the time. So there was no downtime really. And then, my first flight, we were on Mir. We were doing experiments on Mir. We were taking human samples. We were growing cancer cells for research. We were taking data from the alpha magnetic spectrometer, which is a really interesting payload that looks for antimatter in space, because theoretically we should have as much antimatter as matter in the universe, but we don't. And so why we don't was the subject of that research. It's actually up on the International Space Station still. And then my last mission, we helped build the International Space Station. So we took up a section that we added to the station, which is the airlock, which is where people now do spacewalks from. So you're just busy all the time. In fact, to get some window time, takes a little cheating so that, you stay up a little past your bedtime so that you can just look out the window and look at the Earth.
So you spent, I think, about 8 days on the ISS. And so you actually go over and hang out in the ISS. Uh-huh.
Yeah, we did. It wasn't as large as it is today. We had the main lab, and we had the Russian sections, and so we were free to travel along that sort of linear path. And then we added an airlock that sticks out to one side. But yeah, it was phenomenal to be able to compare that to the Mir space station, which I went to first, which is more of a hub and spoke design. So it had a central section with modules sticking out in, all degrees of freedom, and versus the International Space Station, which is linear, and down is always down, all the time. So you don't get confused on orientation.
Probably a hard question to answer because there's so many memorable moments, but what would be one of your most memorable moments of 33 days in space?
I think the most memorable for me personally was a night pass, meaning we flew over the Earth during the 45 minutes of darkness, and we were coming down from north of the British Isles. And we flew over London, and then over the Channel, and then over Paris, and then over Rome, and you could see Italy outlined, and the Mediterranean. All the lights I'm talking about are outlining the countries, and the city lights help you identify which cities. And then we pass over the dark Mediterranean, and then we come to the Nile Peninsula, and you can see the Nile lit up at night. And then you kind of track the Nile down into Africa, which then gets very dark in comparison. But then the thunderstorms start up, and you see all the lightning and the popcorn effect, I always called it, from the cumulonimbus clouds down there that are all lit up from beneath, and it just looks like popcorn popping underneath you. It was just a, I don't know, fascinating pass, and I like to just float there and look out the window and listen to music and chill.
Well, you said something interesting. The whole thing is interesting, by the way, but something you said just a moment ago that I want to back up on. You don't have a lot of time to just be sitting there looking out the window. You're working. You're
Right.
doing experiments. You're doing a lot of different things.
Right, and your day is fully planned. So, and not so much so on the International Space Station today because they're up there for so much longer. But when you only had, 8 days on the space station, or 12 days total on your whole mission, your days are very much constructed to get every minute out of it that they possibly could. And so, it's every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes are scripted for you to go do this work, then go do that work, and then do this. You have 15 minutes for lunch and then go do that. And so if you get behind, you have to either keep on time or you have to be rescheduled to do that task again the next day. And you don't want to have to do that.
Wow, they're taskmasters.
They are taskmasters.
Oh, wow.
They're proud of it too.
Yeah. Some people wonder why we do space exploration. There are definite benefits. What are some of those benefits? What are we learning?
Some of the biggest benefits, in my opinion, are things that we use here today on Earth. So I mentioned we grew cancer cells in space earlier. It's interesting that cancer cells grow really well in space. They grow into form without gravitational forces. So in our bodies, unfortunately, cancer grows into these tumors that are hard to deal with until you take them out of the human and try to study them that way. But in space, they grow very similarly to the way they do in the body. You can't do that here on the ground because in a petri dish, they don't form the same way. But up there, they do. And so we can take all these small tumor cells made from stem cells, we can grow a whole bunch of them, and we can test different types of drugs on them at the same time. And that's what I'm hoping we do on a commercial space station, is have a laboratory where we can take all these different types of cancers. We can try a whole bunch of different drugs at the same time. We can find the 2 or 3 that might work, throw the rest away, and it just helps save time. Now we can focus on those 3 drugs that seem to show promise, do the trials with those, but that can save us years of research here on the ground. And so I think that's one of the areas that we have the most promise. Another potential interesting area would be to be able to take stem cells, introduce cells from our own bodies, and grow new organs for people who have maybe kidney failure or other types of organ failure. And it might be possible to grow an organ in space that you could then bring home and put into our own bodies. So that's a real interesting possibility.
Absolutely fascinating. And I think most people don't really realize the benefits that we are getting out of our space programs.
Yes.
Let's shift gears for a moment. Our Safer Skies video podcast is really, we want to get to know people, but it's really about aviation and aerospace safety. So I don't need to tell you that spaceflight is inherently risky, as demonstrated by 3 tragedies in particular, tragedies that you're well familiar with. In each of those cases, Apollo 1, Challenger, Columbia, the crew members were all fatally injured. 6 months after your last mission, the crew of STS-107 perished when Columbia disintegrated upon re-entry. You were at NASA then. These were your friends. 3 of those astronauts were in your astronaut class. Tell us what hard lessons we've learned because of these tragedies.
Yeah, and I talked earlier about risk and that, astronauts take these risks knowing that what they're doing is worth it, or they wouldn't go. And I know that my friends who were on that flight absolutely knew the risks and were fully willing to take them. So, it was extraordinarily sad. We didn't, you know, uh, we always expected that something like that would probably happen again someday. And it probably still will, because it is such a difficult thing to do. But the things that they brought back, for instance, that was a research mission. So that particular mission, it was laboratory related. They brought back a lot of biological samples, and the research they were doing was to help the health of all of us here on the planet. So it was a very noble mission that they were on. They trained for it a long time. They were a really happy crew. They were a very kind group of people. My classmates were exceptional. Um, and, my family knew that family, speaking of the crew as a family, very well. So it made it more painful in that they were our friends. It did make it especially hard for my children to allow me to fly again. And that was the reason I did quit flying and I'm going to do an aside. I know you know this, but I lost my parents when I was 8 years old in an aircraft accident, in midair situation. And I know the effect that that had on my life. Well, my daughter happened to be 8 years old at the time. Her babysitter, my best friend, was on the mission, and she absolutely could not see me flying again. She would have nightmares every night. And so it was more than just a professional catastrophe, it was a personal catastrophe. It affected my family as well. So I made the difficult decision not to fly again, not because I didn't want to, but because it was too hard. It was too much to ask of my family. And so I went into management and I started, helping others fly, which I think was a good calling. And I still felt very involved. But I did not have any regrets doing that for my children because their well-being was more important to me than for me to get another flight. I'd already had three. They all went really well. I was very happy with that. But back to your question, what do we learn? We learn NASA learns what mistakes it made, what we can't take for granted. We learned from Challenger that you can't expect, that a seal that's frozen not to leak. On Columbia, we learned that you can't expect foam, even though it's lightweight, not to have enough mass to put a hole in the wing, which it did, because the whole force equals mass times acceleration really played out. We didn't have much mass, but we had a lot of acceleration. So we put a hole in the wing. Um, we learned a lot about restraints for the astronauts, very much like in cars, why we have seat belts and why we have head protection for people who are riding motorcycles. We learned that there was, some oversight in the way we had the restraint systems made and the way that the helmets were designed for the astronauts. And so we made changes based on that. We learned that our bones decalcify much faster than we expected because we had that sort of evidence from forensic data. So there was a lot learned from that mission. And so that crew, although they did not come back to us, they still contributed significantly to our knowledge and helped make future flyers far more safer than they would have been otherwise.
I want to thank you for sharing the personal aspects of that you just shared. Um, I read something that then President George W. Bush uh, said after the Columbia accident, and I'll share it with you. The cause of space exploration and discovery is not an option we choose. It is a desire written within the human heart. We find the best among us. We send them forth into the unmapped darkness, and we pray they will return. They go in peace for all mankind, and all mankind is in our debt. So they did pick the best. In your case, in the cases of others, and we, as mankind, we appreciate the debt that you all have paid so that we will benefit.
It is willingly accepted by these folks. They certainly know the risk that they're taking. And so
Thank you.
appreciate that.
Well, today, spaceflight is alive and well. There are plenty of young people out there who share the same passions, the same interests, the same desires that you had looking up in space. So what advice might you have for someone who is motivated by the space industry?
I think so many people now have the opportunity to try space flight than they did in the past. It is open to more people, and it will continue to be so. If you want to just do a very quick up and down ride on a New Shepard vehicle that is sponsored by Blue Origin, you have the ability to do that. You just go up above the Kármán line and ride back down. You don't get a lot of weightlessness, but you get 2 or 3 minutes or so of that. And you do get to see the Earth's, horizon and curvature and the blackness of space. If you want to be a professional career astronaut, really, still one of the best ways is through NASA. You can apply to NASA, and they just hired a new class recently. So that dream is still alive for a lot of those folks. And then I think alternatively in the future, we will have astronauts that are hired by commercial companies who will also be career astronauts. So if NASA or commercial companies decide to build commercial space stations and platforms that will do research in space, it may be a cooperative communication between all these different entities to design and come up with the best plan to support that. And then there may still be NASA astronauts who work with commercial astronauts. And that's part of what I did in my last role at Sierra Space, was defining what type of training those people would need to go through, what kinds of expertise they would have, and how they would work with NASA and other commercial companies.
So looking back on all of the years that you've looked toward the skies, beginning with those nights on the back porch with your father in Missouri, and then through the windows of the space shuttle and the ISS, what thoughts would you like to leave us with?
Well, to people who are wondering if they can make it, you certainly can. If you have a dream or an aspiration that you want to achieve in life, I mean, there's a lot of luck involved, no doubt, but the determination that you have to pursue it, not to give up on it. I had the big words above my desk in my dorm room was "never give up." Those kinds of things are really important to inspire yourself to keep motivated and to not quit. That's the most important part. And it doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what your background, your family does. If you want to do something great, you can do that. If you want to be a doctor, if you want to be an astronomer, if you want to be a geologist, it doesn't really matter. If you want to be an astronaut or a pilot, my husband and I were lucky enough to get to achieve those dreams. So just keep at it, don't give up, and pursue those dreams.
What an inspirational message. Dr. Janet Kavandi, I want to thank you for all that you've done for humankind through your service to the space industry. And I want to thank you for being our very first guest on Safer Skies.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been quite the honor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Robert Sumwalt. Join us again for our next special episode of Safer Skies.